The moon cast an eerie glow over the empty parking lot as John stepped out of his car and into the desolate silence. It was his first night working alone on the night shift, and he couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling that something was amiss. The strange shadows that danced around him seemed to whisper secrets, and the wind carried an ominous melody that sent shivers down his spine. As he entered the dimly lit building, the silence seemed to envelop him, suffocating his thoughts. The corridors stretched out like endless tunnels, each step echoing through the empty space. The flickering fluorescent lights added a touch of uncertainty, casting distorted shapes on the walls. John's heart raced as he made his way to his station, feeling as if unseen eyes were watching his every move. The hours ticked by slowly, and with each passing minute, the weight of isolation grew heavier on John's shoulders. The emptiness of the place became suffocating, a consuming darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. The distant sound of his own footsteps reverberated through the silence, a haunting reminder that he was utterly alone. Suddenly, a creaking noise echoed from a nearby corridor, causing John's heart to leap into his throat. He froze, his eyes darting around the room, desperately trying to identify the source of the disturbance. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed through the building, growing louder with each passing second. Panic surged through his veins as he realized that he was no longer alone. Trembling, John cautiously made his way towards the corridor where the sound originated. The flickering lights intensified, casting grotesque shadows that danced with malevolence. As he moved forward, the whispers grew louder, filled with sinister laughter and menacing whispers. John's mind spun with fear, his heart pounding in his ears, drowning out any rational thought. Finally, he reached the corridor, only to find it empty. The footsteps had ceased, leaving only an unsettling silence in their wake. John's breath came in ragged gasps, his body soaked in a cold sweat. He fought the urge to flee, to abandon his post and run far away from this nightmare. But duty bound him, and he knew he had to stay. As the night wore on, John's nerves were stretched to their limits. Strange occurrences became the norm, as objects moved on their own accord and disembodied whispers echoed through the halls. Shadows seemed to dance with increasing intensity, morphing into twisted shapes that seemed to mock his fear. The building itself seemed alive, its walls pulsating with an eerie energy that seemed to feed off his terror. Just as the first signs of daylight began to peek through the windows, John's shift finally came to an end. His body and mind exhausted, he stumbled out of the building, grateful to leave the nightmare behind. As he locked the door, he couldn't help but wonder what horrors awaited the next unfortunate soul who would be condemned to endure the night shift alone. It was a gloomy night as Sarah stepped into the dimly lit office building. The clock struck midnight, signaling the start of her dreaded night shift. The silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the distant hum of the flickering fluorescent lights. Sarah had always been a shy and introverted person, preferring the solitude of her own thoughts. However, being alone in this vast, empty building threw her into a state of unease. As she sat down at her desk, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes peering out from the darkness. The creaking of the old wooden floors echoed through the hallways, creating an eerie soundtrack to her nightly routine. She tried to distract herself by focusing on the tasks at hand, but the shadows seemed to grow longer and more menacing, dancing on the walls like sinister specters. Every flicker of a light, every unexpected noise sent shivers down Sarah's spine. The office phone rang, making her jump out of her skin. Trembling, she picked up the receiver, only to be greeted by static on the other end. A chill ran down her spine as she slowly placed the phone back onto its cradle. As the night wore on, Sarah's imagination began to run wild. Every little sound became a potential threat, and every shadow seemed to take on a life of its own. The distant sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, growing louder and closer with each passing moment. Sweat trickled down her forehead as she tried to rationalize the source of the noise. With a trembling hand, Sarah cautiously ventured out of her office, determined to confront whatever was lurking in the dark corridors. Heart pounding, she tiptoed towards the source of the footsteps. The oppressive silence was broken by a sudden gust of wind, extinguishing the flickering lights. In complete darkness, Sarah felt a presence closing in on her. Panic consumed her as the footsteps grew nearer, echoing through the stillness. She tried to scream, but her voice was lost in the void that surrounded her. Just as she thought she couldn't bear it any longer, the lights flickered back to life, revealing her surroundings. She found herself standing alone, surrounded by the empty stillness of the office. Confused and shaken, Sarah stumbled back to her desk, desperately longing for the night to end. The seconds ticked away agonizingly slow, each minute feeling like an eternity. Finally, the first rays of daylight streamed through the office windows, banishing the darkness that had haunted Sarah throughout the long night. Exhausted, she gathered her things, promising herself that she would never endure another night shift alone. As Sarah walked away from the office building, she couldn't help but look back one last time. The building stood tall and foreboding, as if keeping its secrets hidden within. She shuddered, vowing to never return to that place of darkness again, for the night shift alone had forever changed her.